For decades, popular history has focused on tanks, rifles, and battlefield tactics. Yet some of the most decisive wartime innovations were quiet, practical solutions designed to keep soldiers alive when nature was just as deadly as the enemy. In the frozen forests of Europe, the mountains of Italy, and the blizzard-swept expanses of Scandinavia, Allied and Axis troops quickly learned that tents were often liabilities. Canvas tore, poles snapped, and rigid structures collapsed under snow load and wind shear. What quietly replaced them in some of the harshest theatres of World War II was a simple but devastatingly effective shelter system built around a reinforced ridge tie. This single structural element allowed soldiers to construct shelters that resisted storms, which would have destroyed standard tents in minutes. Understanding how this ridge tie worked reveals a forgotten layer of wartime ingenuity that remains deeply relevant for modern survivalists. Why standard military tents failed catastrophically in winter combat zones. World War II-era tents were primarily designed for speed of deployment and mass production, not extreme weather resilience. Most relied on vertical poles and thin guy lines, creating stress points that concentrated load rather than dispersing it. In heavy snowfall, weight accumulated unevenly, causing poles to buckle. In high winds, fabric flapped violently, tearing seams and pulling stakes free. Soldiers in the Ardennes, the Apennines, and the Eastern Front recorded frequent shelter failures, sometimes multiple times per night, leading to frostbite, exhaustion, and reduced combat readiness. Commanders quickly realized that warmth and shelter were strategic resources, not comforts, and, well, improvisation became essential. How the ridge tie fundamentally changed shelter engineering. The ridge tie was not a new invention, but its wartime application was refined under pressure. Instead of relying on upright poles, soldiers suspended a single, extremely strong cord wire or webbing strap between two fixed anchor points, such as trees, posts, or rock faces. This ridge tie became the spine of the shelter. Fabric, tarps, ponchos, or even salvage parachute cloth were draped over it, allowing gravity to work in favour of the structure rather than against it. Snow slid off naturally instead of accumulating. Wind flowed over curved surfaces instead of striking flat walls. The load was distributed horizontally along the ridge tie, dramatically increasing durability. Why World War II ridge ties survived blizzards when tents did not? The key advantage of the ridge tie system was load distribution. Snow load was transferred along the length of the ridge and into anchor points that were far stronger than portable poles. Wind forces were absorbed by flexible materials rather than resisted by rigid frames. Soldiers often doubled or even tripled ridgelines, twisting cords together or using steel aircraft cable whenever it was available. In some alpine units, ridge ties were tensioned using mechanical advantage knots, which allowed shelters to remain taut even as materials contracted in freezing temperatures. Field reports describe ridge tie shelters remaining intact through multi-day storms that, well, collapsed nearby tent camps entirely. So, how did soldiers actually construct these shelters out in the field? Construction followed a repeatable process that really prioritized strength over speed. First, 2 anchors were selected that simply could not shift under load. Mature trees were preferred, but vehicles, boulders, and even artillery pieces were sometimes used. The ridge tie was set chest high and tensioned until it produced minimal sag. Next, fabric was draped evenly on both sides, creating a steep roof angle. The edges were staked low and tight to prevent wind entry. Soldiers often reinforced stress points with spare cloth or leather patches. In extreme cold, snow was intentionally banked along the shelter edges, creating insulation without adding roof weight. This method produced a structure that blended into the terrain while maintaining internal warmth. What materials prove most effective for ridge ties? Not all cords performed equally. Cotton rope absorbed moisture and froze, losing flexibility and strength. Veterans quickly favoured waxed linen, hemp treated with grease, or repurposed parachute suspension lines. Steel wire was used in permanent or semi-permanent positions, but required insulation to prevent heat loss through conduction. In the later stages of the war, webbing straps designed for cargo restraint became prized for ridge ties because they resisted stretching under load. Now, how this World War II method applies directly to modern survival practice is really quite fascinating. Modern survivalists can apply the ridge tie principle with minimal equipment. A single length of static climbing rope or modern paracord, when properly tensioned, can, well, outperform many commercial tents in wind and snow. Using trees or natural anchors eliminates the weakest component of most shelters, portable poles. A tarp pitched over a ridge tie at a steep angle will shed rain and snow efficiently. For cold environments, banking snow around the base increases insulation dramatically. This approach is particularly valuable for long-term camps, emergency shelters, and situations where stealth or low visibility is required. Ridge tie shelters were, not just more durable, but also quieter, warmer, and tactically superior. Beyond their strength, these shelters offered real advantages on the battlefield. For instance, they produced less noise during high winds, which reduced the risk of detection. Their low profile made them much harder to spot from a distance. And, heat retention was improved because airflow could be controlled quite precisely at ground level, rather than relying on flapping fabric. Soldiers actually reported better sleep quality and reduced fatigue, which in turn translated directly into improved combat effectiveness. These benefits really explain why, once conditions deteriorated, experienced units often abandoned their issued tents entirely. There's a lesson here that history quietly teaches us through this somewhat forgotten detail. The World War II ridge tie is a reminder that survival, more often than not, depends on understanding the forces at play, rather than simply fighting against them. By working with gravity, wind, and load distribution, soldiers managed to create shelters that outperformed industrial solutions, all while using fewer resources. This knowledge, you see, was passed along informally from unit to unit, and was rarely documented in official manuals, which is, perhaps, why it faded from mainstream history. If you value uncovering these overlooked lessons of the past and applying them with real-world relevance, subscribe to In the Beginning, Share this video with your fellow history enthusiasts and help keep practical history alive for future generations.